Nelson Mandela Foundation has partnered with the South African Human Rights Commission to launch a podcast titled Wabhubha Umhlaba. This podcast will reflect on the 2021 July unrest. And for more on this, we are now joined by Kneo Mokgopa, a writer and researcher at the Nelson Mandela Foundation. Good morning to you, Kneo. Thank you very much for joining us here on the South African Morning. First and foremost, talk to us about what sparked interest in creating a podcast of this nature.
Thank you, and good morning to yourself and your viewers as well. So, near the end of 2021, shortly after the unrest, of course, there were those catastrophic floods, and we were in KZN in different parts of the region, conducting some work, some peace building work, workshops, trying to rebuild relationships between communities and otherwise. And what we realized was that even within people who lived in KwaZulu-Natal, there was a great need to make sense of the events that took place in July. But moreover, in some of the reporting and the conversations around the country surrounding the unrest, it was clear that there was a difficulty in framing the thing that happened, and there's still a difficulty in framing it. We've referred to it as a failed unrest, the Zuma insurrection. We've called it the public violence, the riots, the food riots, and so many other things. And so with this podcast, we were trying to make sense and create a safe enough space for people who've been affected to speak truth to power, to tell their story and to share their experiences, but also to create an archive, a publicly accessible archive that members of the public, movement builders, organizers, and others can reflect on in terms of understanding not only KwaZulu-Natal as a region, but the broader state of this country.
And that was going to be my next question. Why a specific focus then on these two topics that are linked to the KwaZulu-Natal province somewhat? There are numerous issues plaguing the country at the moment. Why focus on the July unrest and the KZN floods? And why is there also a specific focus on the KZN province?
So maybe with the first question first, why the unrest? There's so many other issues. I think you're right, you're very right. But something about the unrest really became to symbolize some of the ruptures that we've been experiencing as a country. Ruptures such as Marikana, these fractures in the relationship between the state and the citizen. Life at Sidimeni was another rupture, and there's so many others, you know what I mean? And so the unrest really, because of how multifocal it was, and even the expert panel into the unrest really points out how, yes, of course, there was political factions within the ANC that supported this, yes, the security agencies, but also far-running poverty and inequality. We had just come out of COVID and those lockdowns. We've been battling with load shedding. And so the unrest comes to really highlight and articulate very succinctly the condition that we're in as a country. And so we thought that through a podcast, we would be able to explore some of these themes, some of the conditions that we're finding ourselves in, but also a podcast specifically because of how far more accessible it is in terms of data usage and otherwise. And like video streaming, audio streaming is a lot cheaper, a lot more affordable, and as well if it can be downloaded and then shared on WhatsApp. And that's something that we're really interested in.
Interesting. Now, there's also the topic of peace building within the KZN province that's also included in the podcast. Talk to us about the importance and the work that's being done in this space.
No, thank you for that question as well. I think I really wanted to acknowledge the South African Human Rights Commission, who we've partnered with on this podcast, who's doing really incredible work in terms of peace building and nation building in that way. The initiative is called SHINE, and I may touch on I may not necessarily get the acronym completely right, but it's about the Social Harmony National Effort. And it's a project from the Commission that is going into communities, especially affected communities, who've been affected by things such as the unrest, things such as the floods and, the climate crisis and otherwise. And trying to, number one, to understand their experiences, their perspectives, and to really kind of garner empathy for what's actually happening to people's lives. But then further than that, then to begin charting out a way forward, because during the struggle, freedom was a lot more easy to articulate. It was in the date, it was get the NP out of power and usher in democracy. But some of those needs in this contemporary space are less clear. It's so clear what is needed. And so by consulting with different people, especially people that have been affected by crisis, such as the unrest, and understanding their personal needs around freedom, their personal journeys towards full actualization, self-determination, and otherwise, we can really begin addressing things such as nation building. And maybe just one more point around that is that as the foundation, at least some of the work that we've been doing and the research and the conversations and dialogues we've had, what what's clear for us is that we can't have any meaningful reconciliation, any meaningful redress, and you know what I mean, harmony as a society, without some of the very, very fundamental issues being resolved. And just to name them quickly, is the land still remains a very sore contestation point, you know, and then of course pervasive inequality, extreme inequality. We can't heal as a nation, we can't move forward as a nation until we've addressed those two very real practical elements.
Yeah, definitely important issues. Now, I think when telling stories like this, it's important to get different perspectives and different angles. Talk to us about the type of guests that have been included in this podcast and how you guys are going to ensure that every story in the story is told.
Sure. So far we've spoken to Gogo Ndlovu as well as Abuti Pilile, who are both street vendors in KwaZulu-Natal. Gogo Ndlovu sells by the hotels at South Beach. And then Ntate Pilile, he sells at there's a space called the Workshop, I believe it's called. There's a bit of a bus terminal there. So we got their perspectives from very much on the ground as the movement began, but also around their lives, moreover, and how they understand their society and how this thing could have happened. The other people that we've spoken to have been Thapelo Mohapi, who is the Secretary General of Abahlali Basamjondolo, who gave really, really profound insights and very, very compelling narratives about the thing that happened. One of them especially being how of the 350 or so people that unfortunately died, tragically died during the unrest, the majority of them were not killed by the police, not killed by security guards. They died as a result of them trying to get to the food with these stampedes and otherwise. We will be speaking to Professor Tsepo Madlingozi as well as Professor Serote about nation building and reconciliation and decolonization, especially thinking about the histories of Mkhulu Credo Mutwa and Chief Albert Lutuli. We've also spoken to Dr. Mbongiseni Buthelezi, and then we're also going to be speaking to the residents of Phoenix in particular to understand the events that took place in Phoenix, especially because it was such a contested narrative. On the one hand, some people saying no,
No, let me just
nothing
interrupt
happened.
you there. I just want to find out, before we run out of time, I want to find out where people can access this podcast. How do people watch?
Sure. So the podcast is out from this morning. We've released the prologue. It's available on all podcast streaming platforms. It's on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, Google Podcasts, and many others where you can stream your podcasts.
Great, Kneo. Thank you for your time and your insights, and all the best with the podcast. I hope that it is a huge success.